Yo, what's up guys? I'm starting a little series called Schmem sessions where I run through some theory related to windsurfing and how it can help you on the water, which will include things like tide, weather, aerodynamics, sail theory, board theory and anything else I can think of that could help you improve your windsurfing knowledge. If you're starting to windsurf on the sea, it's useful to know about tide, not only as a safety factor, but sometimes different spots will suit different states of tide. I'll cover how tides work, how to judge the tide in real time, and how different states of tide can make your session more fun. So how do tides work? It's no mystery that tides are caused by the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun, as well as the rotation of the earth. As a result, for us windsurfers, we're interested in the tide going up and down, as well as the tide going in and out. Let's start with up and down. The area where you windsurf will look different at different points in the day. At low tide we can see that there isn't much water and you'll typically see sandbars, rocks and generally more land will be visible than would otherwise be covered by the sea. At high tide the sandbars will be covered by water and the sea level is much higher up on the shoreline. When we talk about the in and out, we're talking about the horizontal movement of the water flowing parallel to the coastline. Generally speaking, if the water is flowing from the larger area of water to the smaller, the tide is coming in or flooding. If the water is flowing from the smaller area to the larger area, the tide is going out or ebbing. Here's the rule of 12ths to explain the tide flooding. Let's call low tide 0 hours. The water takes roughly 6 hours to go from low tide to high tide and vice versa. So the tide is now starting to come up. After the first hour, the amount of water will rise by 1/12 of the total range. It starts off pretty slow. In the second hour, the water will rise by a further 2/12, so total 3/12 of water. In the third hour, there are 3/12 of water flooding in, total of 6/12, so the halfway point. In the fourth hour, again, there is 3/12 of water flooding in, totaling 9/12. In the fifth hour, there is 2/12 of water flooding in, totaling 11/12. And in the sixth and final hour of the tide coming in, the last 1/12 of water is coming in, totaling 12/12. This is exactly the same for the tide going out as well. Springs versus neaps. A spring tide is where there is the greatest difference between high and low water, so you get a really high tide and a really low tide. A neap tide is where there is the smallest difference between high and low water, so you get a fairly low high tide and a fairly high low tide. So why is this useful to us windsurfers? Well, it's useful to know how strong the tide will be at any given time. During the third and fourth hours of the tide coming in or going out, it is the strongest and will have more of an effect on us and our kit. The tide is weakest during the first and final hours of the tide coming in and going out, so it won't have much of an effect on us. This is a great time for beginner windsurfers to go out as it's much safer and there's less to think about. Remember, the deeper the water, the stronger the tide will flow, and the shallower you are, the less of an effect the tide will have on you. So if you're new on the sea, stick to the shallow areas. Also, if the wind is going against the tide, it will make the water choppy, and if the wind is with the tide, it will flatten off the water. How to judge the tide in real time. It's a good idea to check the tide timetable before you go out on the water. In addition to this, it's good to know what to look for to be able to judge what is actually happening in real life. Wet sand. If you're on the beach by the sea, look at the sand a couple of meters from the water. If the sand is wet, it means that the tide is going out, and if the sand is dry, it's most likely coming in. Seaweed. If there's lots of seaweed on the beach, it could mean that the tide is currently out or at low tide. Moored boats. Some boats that are attached to moorings dry out, so if you see a boat attached to a mooring on the sand, it's likely low tide. If there are moored boats that are floating, it could but not necessarily be high tide. You can see the direction of the tide using these boats. Boats will always lay pointing into the direction of the strongest element. If the boat is in deep water, it will most likely point to where the tide is coming from. However, if it's super windy, the boat may lie to the wind, in which case it wouldn't be the best judge of where the tide is coming from. If the wind is calm and all the boats are facing different directions, it could mean that the tide is about to change. Sometimes just by looking at the general direction of the current of the water, you can tell which way the tide is going. Other boats. If a boat or any other craft is in the water, they could be affected by the tide. So compare different craft on the water, and if they are all slipping in the same direction, the tide is most likely going that way. How different states of tide will make your sessions more fun. I will often plan my whole session around the tide. At my local spot, when the tide is low, the sandbar provides a perfect barrier from any chop or turbulence, so you get perfectly flat water for about a mile, which is ideal for freestyle and was great when I was learning to tack, jibe and just about any planing manoeuvre. At lots of spots with a sandbar, mid-tide can be really good for waves. When the tide is too high, sometimes the waves won't form and break well, and at low tide there just isn't enough water. So depending on the wind direction, mid-tide is great for wave riders. For beginners, having sandbars available for a rest is great, so going out in low or mid to low tide is ideal. Shallow water is also a safer option. What apps I use to check the tide? There are plenty of apps out there. I use an app called My Tide Times, which is a free app that tells you when high tide and low tide is for that day, and a few days after as well. You can also look up tide times on Google, or if you're old school, you can just use a physical tide timetable. So hopefully that wasn't too strenuous and gave you an insight into tides. I personally grew up around the water, so came to learn my local spot pretty early on, but there are things that I didn't know about the tide in specific places that I only came to learn after many sessions. So you will learn a lot by just being out on the water and from gaining experience. Remember, if you're ever in doubt, just ask a local who knows their stuff.